My guest today is Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Professor Sachs needs no introduction to most of you. He is a vocal public intellectual who speaks out in favour of peace and international collaboration and against hostilities in places such as Ukraine, Gaza, and elsewhere. Professor Sachs serves as the director of the Centre for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. He's the president of the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network, a commissioner of the UN Broadband Commission for Development, and an SDG advocate for UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Welcome to the show, Professor Sachs.
Well, very good to be with you, Warwick. Thank you.
Great to have you. Look, you obviously spend a lot of time talking lately about wars and what's wrong with them, but with your indulgence, I'd like to shift the focus away from that today and discuss issues of global finance in the context of developmental and ecological challenges. A few weeks ago, Scott Bessent, on the sidelines of the spring meetings of the IMF, argued that the World Bank and IMF should get back to core business rather than finance things like climate initiatives. Given that the US doesn't contribute to the IMF's voluntary environmental fund in any case, it seems that Bessent's interventions were a little bit more about American power politics rather than anything else. Could you perhaps comment a little bit on where the US currently stands in relation to multilateral global finance institutions, and what do you make of Secretary Bessent's comments in relation to what he thinks the IMF should get focused upon?
Well, the U.S. is not only retreating from the global sustainable development agenda, it's openly in attack of the global agenda. There was a very innocuous UN General Assembly resolution proposed by Bahrain a few weeks ago, calling for a day of peaceful coexistence, something that is pretty standard fare for the UN. And the US delegate stood up to say, we oppose this. We oppose this resolution on two grounds. One, we don't like the phrase peaceful coexistence because the Chinese use it. Well, there you go. That's American mentality. And second, we oppose the Sustainable Development Goals. We view them hostile to U.S. interests. Amazing. These SDGs were adopted by unanimity in September 2015 because the world needs a measure of cooperation and coordination to achieve economic well-being, to achieve some social justice, to achieve environmental sustainability, and to achieve peace and cooperation. Well, the U.S. isn't having any of it. The U.S. Is pretty much against all of those things. It's breaking up the trade system. There is no acceptable talk in modern American politics about social justice. The environment has been kicked out of the agenda by Donald Trump, for whom drill baby drill is the only appropriate energy policy. And peace and cooperation is viewed as for losers. So this is not an American agenda. The U.S. government, I should say, is really spending a lot of time emphasizing that it is in outright opposition to even the rhetoric of sustainable development or global cooperation and so on. And it's taking specific action by withholding dues from the UN, opposing capital increases at the regional and global development banks, that is the World Bank family and regional development banks, pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. It's a very systematic set of reactions by the United States against the rest of the global community. So what Mr. Bessent said in that context is just par for the course right now, which is that the United States will not do multilateralism, period. not multilateral finance, not multilateral agreements like the Sustainable Development Goals, not multilateral treaties. That is what's called, broadly speaking, America First. And it does mean that if the rest of the world is going to get something done, it's not going to happen in Washington. It's not going to happen at the World Bank. It's not going to happen at the IMF. It can happen in other development banks around the world. It can happen with the new development bank. That's the BRICS Bank in Shanghai. It can happen with the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank that China started up a few years ago. It can conceivably happen in some of the mainstream multilateral development banks like the African Development Bank or the Asian Development Bank if those banks don't let the United States wreck their agenda.
Often people think that the US dollar is necessary to finance a lot of these initiatives, and I guess historically that might well have been the case, but increasingly it seems that the technologies and know-how, in particular for economic development and for sustainable economic development and ecological initiatives, can be accessed from all sorts of other markets, which means that you don't necessarily need US dollars in your own wallet to mobilize those resources for your own development. You touched on the BRICS Bank and some of the other multilateral banks. Where do you think over the next 5 years those institutions are likely to head in terms of responding to what is clearly a retrenchment from the United States in global institutional finance? And how do you think that might play out over the foreseeable future, insofar as the discombobulations of globalization as things stand today?
There are several interconnected and intertwined issues here. One is that the U.S. doesn't want to be part of the broad development agenda, as I said. Second, it doesn't want to finance anyone else's development. The U.S. is out to make money for itself, maybe even at the personal level of American leaders, but also institutionally. This is the claim of America First. We're in it for ourselves. We don't contribute to others. They contribute to us. So there's that element. But there's another element that one should absolutely appreciate, and that is that the global financial system, based heavily but far from exclusively on the US dollar, is also used as a foreign policy mechanism to enforce US policy desires through the sanctions regime. Sanctions come in many shapes and forms. That certain people are not welcome into the United States, that certain businesses are not allowed to do trade with U.S. companies, that foreign exchange assets of supposedly hostile countries like Russia or Venezuela or Iran are frozen in the institutions in which those deposits have been made in the past. So the role of the US dollar is not only as a payments mechanism or a way to mobilize investment finance, but it's also an instrument of enforcing US foreign policy. And the big threat is that you are a bank abroad that is sanctioned and not allowed to participate in this dollar-based banking structure, including the clearing system called the SWIFT clearing system. And this weaponization of the dollar is yet another reason for countries outside of the immediate U.S. orbit to say, what is this? The U.S. Isn't participating, it's polluting, but it's not acknowledging even the basics of climate change. It's not accepting any historical responsibility. It's not accepting the responsibility of being a rich country in a world in which there is still terrible poverty. And incidentally, in a lot of these poor countries where the U.S. has played a direct role often historically, and undermining stability, overthrowing governments, assassinating leaders, and doing many other sordid deeds that should give some responsibility, even for reparative justice, if you will, for reparations or for other financial flows based on historical responsibility. Of course, the U.S. will accept none of this, especially under our current government. So other countries have to do things that get around this. Now, this brings us to the question of money. Money, we say in economics, is a light veil on the real economy. In other words, the dollars that are either the physical printed bills of the Federal Reserve or the electronic ciphers that signify that you have a dollar account that in principle could get turned into a green piece of paper that is a U.S. Federal Reserve note. All of this is not the real economy of industry, of mining, of agriculture, of services. It's the means to engage in trade in the real economy. It is an instrumentality, a public good that enables trade other than through barter. That's the idea of money. It allows for very flexible, multilateral, multi-sectoral trade, not direct barter or physical goods. The reason I mention this obvious point is you don't need the US dollar to bring about that trade. If India and Russia are engaged in trade where Russia is selling its oil to India, and in return, India is exporting, say, some IT services or back office operations or online business processing or some primary manufacturing for inputs into into Russian industry. Whatever it is, that transaction does not require the U.S. dollar. It could be carried out as barter, not very efficiently. It could be carried out in rubles. It could be carried out in rupees. It could be carried out in some other third currency, like renminbi, like the Chinese currency. But it does not need dollars for the transactions between Russia and India. And this is the basic point. Create alternatives. If the U.S. is going to give you a hard time using the dollars, if it's going to confiscate your reserves, if it's going to demand that you abide by U.S. foreign policy or else facing sanctions, or else facing your balances frozen, other countries are going to try to come up with alternatives. And the BRICS countries, which are now 10 large emerging economies, starting with the 5 BRICS originally, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now expanded to include Ethiopia and Egypt and UAE and Iran and Indonesia, so 10 in total, actually have a very practical case for creating non-dollar payments among themselves so that they're not vulnerable to U.S. foreign policy demands, and because it's actually pretty efficient not to use the dollar, not to go through the U.S. dollar, but maybe to use the currencies of the BRICS themselves for the settlements in a bilateral transaction, as I said, between India and Russia. Maybe use rubles or use rupiah as the currency of denomination and the payments for the actual settlement of the trade. So the BRICS are starting that process. It's a little slow because the U.S. is making threats. Don't you dare do something other than the dollar. And some countries then slow down. India is very cautious. We don't want to move too fast. Russia, of course, is much more enthusiastic because it's been sanctioned. It's been very hard hit. China is somewhere in the middle because it is likely that the renminbi will be a major, if not the major, alternative to the US dollar for a lot of transactions, because China's already in volume of and market value, already the lead trade partner for probably 125, if not already 150 countries around the world. So I'm encouraging the BRICS go faster, be more systematic, create institutions, basically new banks that are not vulnerable to sanction by the US, because they're not dealing with US dollars. They're only dealing with non-dollar payments. So the long arm of the US sanctions threat doesn't reach those institutions. I'm telling the BRICS governments that are asking or are interested, get on with it, because no one country, especially one that has weaponized its currency, should be at the center of the financial system.
One of the interesting things in the last few months, particularly on the back of the tariff war, has been significant instabilities in the US Treasuries market, and at the same time, concerns around the US dollar, as well as the stock market. So we've had a triple whammy, which is quite an unusual set of correlated negative sentiments. With all of that happening, there does seem to be a paradox, though, Jeffrey, and that is that whilst the US at one level says it wants to maintain the privileged position of being the reserve currency, it can really only do that by sustaining a trade deficit. And so, in a sense, it can't have it both ways. It can't tackle the trade deficit question if it wants to retain the reserve currency status. How do you think this ends up resolving itself? Because global markets are really been shaken a lot, which creates impetus, I guess, for alternatives. And not only the BRICS, I noticed that Christine Lagarde from the European Central Bank actually saw this as an opportunity for the euro to step into the breach. So there's a lot going on in terms of global finance that and I'd appreciate some insights on as to how this is going to unfold.
Yep.
What should particularly the global South, I guess, be keeping an eye on?
One thing, just to clarify, it's not really true that the U.S. has to run a trade deficit because it's a reserve currency. It could run the balancing where other countries accumulate short-term dollar assets could be offset not by goods flows, but by the U.S. On the other side of the balance sheet accumulating longer-term financial assets in other countries. It doesn't have to be that the U.S. Buys more goods than it exports. It could be that instead it is buying financial assets of these other countries. And quantitatively, this argument that the trade deficit is simply a reflection of the U.S. role in the financial sector, I think is not correct. The U.S. has been at the center of the world financial system basically since 1945, and really in the 1950s and 60s, certainly. And the U.S. used to run a trade surplus. It just wasn't, there's no tight link. The trade deficit, in my opinion, is mainly a reflection of the U.S. budget deficit, which is a kind of credit card for the American private economy. The government borrows a lot. It makes transfers to businesses and to households at a very large rate on the basis of its borrowing. And then the households and businesses use those government transfers to fund consumption spending or investment spending. And the result is that the U.S. ends up in total spending more than it produces. And that translates absolutely directly into importing more than it exports, because it's that margin of extra goods that's reflecting the fact that the U.S. is outspending its income. So I view the trade deficit not as a result of the U.S. reserve currency status, or certainly not, as Trump claims, as the result of the unfair practices of the 100+ countries that happen to run trade surpluses vis-a-vis the United States. The U.S. trade deficit vis-a-vis those countries comes from the fact that the U.S. outspends national income by about $1 trillion a year right now, which for the U.S. economy is roughly 3% of GDP. But the reason it does that is mainly that the budget of the federal government outspends the revenues by roughly twice that, by about $2 trillion a year, or roughly 6 or 7% of US GDP. So we could close the trade deficit if we wanted, not by these foolish and destructive tariffs, but rather by closing the budget deficit. And that's what the United States should be doing. Of course, it's not at all what this big, beautiful bill, as Donald Trump calls it, which is for more tax cuts, actually is going to do. It's going to raise the deficit even beyond what we have right now. So I see no necessity for the U.S. to be in this trap. You asked the question, what should developing countries do in general? Well, they're facing all sorts of instabilities. They're facing the threats of U.S. tariffs. We don't know where that's going because Trump changes his mind from morning till night. We also have court rulings in the United States rightly declaring that Trump's tariffs are illegal because they're an assertion by the executive branch of taxes that should be voted by Congress. And I think that this is absolutely correct. So developing countries face a lot of instability, and they're looking for what to do. My own general advice, it depends on which part of the world and the particular circumstances, but try to have normal relations with the U.S., but also with China, with India, with Russia, with Africa. Don't let the United States dictate who your trade partners are. That's ridiculous. The United States can decide for itself what it's going to do. I think it's making a big mistake in going protectionist. But in any event, don't let the United States tell Indonesia or any other place what to do. This is something for those countries to decide. In general, as I said, 125 to 150 countries have China as the main trade partner. For sure, don't let the United States say, oh, don't trade with China. That's something that is not America's business, frankly.
Look, we're starting to get close to time, but if I could just ask you one last question, which is really focusing on, I guess, some institutional questions. I mean, we started this discussion around the IMF and the World Bank and some of the multilateral institutions, and you did touch on the BRICS Bank. Perhaps we could wrap this discussion up by returning to the question of the BRICS Bank, which of course has a lot of interest from around the world. Where do you see that particular institution playing a greater role, not only in trade finance, but also in the areas of development finance and in the area of ecologically sustainable development finance?
Yeah, it's a great question. This is a new bank. In fact, it is called the new development bank. It's a bank established by the BRICS countries. It is the president of the bank is the former president Dilma Rousseff of Brazil. It is based in Shanghai. It's open for business and it's expanding. It's a very important bank because if the World Bank is basically not allowed to expand and be creative and do things because the United States is breathing down the neck of the World Bank, and controls the World Bank effectively, well, the BRICS Bank provides a major financing alternative. Its main role is not only to be an alternative to the World Bank, but that is one of the roles, in fact, in geopolitics that the U.S. dominates the World Bank. Think of it, the World Bank is at 18th Street and Pennsylvania Avenue. The White House is at 16th Street and Pennsylvania Avenue. So the World Bank is right on the block of power together with the U.S. Treasury and the White House. And that's not an accident. It is America's bank, even though it's called the World Bank. So the New Development Bank has a different political base. The political base are the BRICS countries. The mandate should be financing sustainable development of the members of the bank, which incidentally are far more numerous than the BRICS countries themselves. So countries outside of the BRICS are also enabled to borrow from the bank if the bank has them as part owner or as a member of the banks. I would like to see the New Development Bank expand its scale of operations and its mandate. I have some specific ideas which I'm proposing that the bank take on some of the direct ecological challenges, for example, to help oversee a global forestry fund that needs a home in a multilateral development bank. And it seems to me, because of Brazil and Indonesia's common interest in preserving the world's forests, that the New Development Bank is the right place for that. I think it's pretty obvious that the New Development Bank will play a role not only in the typical physical infrastructure projects, but also in ecological projects, in social investments. The interesting question is whether it will begin to play a role of some kind in international monetary affairs as well. And in other words, will it act with some central banking features so that it, for example, would provide liquidity if there's some kind of financial crisis among the BRICS countries? The IMF would say, no, this is our exclusive domain. But if the IMF, which is at 19th and Pennsylvania Avenue, is also under the thumb of the United States, it's going to be too limited in authority to play a constructive role, say, in Iran, or a constructive role in Russia or in another country that is being blocked by the United States. So I would like to see the New Development Bank expand its scale of operation, its scope of operation, and I would like to see it study at least the potential role that it could play in providing liquidity and overcoming financial panics and so forth. In other words, to what extent could it be a quasi-central bank of the BRICS countries?
Well, given
or at least just to say, maybe better put, to what extent could it be an international lender of last resort for liquidity and reserves for the BRICS countries?
Well, given that its foundational members are actually substantial emerging economies, you would think that from a real resources point of view, it certainly does have the capability of being able to fulfill that role. And I guess
that's correct.
And I guess the challenge now is getting those member countries aligned and to share the ambitions that you've articulated for the New Development Bank to really build on its last 10 years to go to the next level, particularly given the financial and geopolitical problems and circumstances that we face today. Look, Jeffrey, I know you've got to run. I've got about 20 other questions, but they'll just have to wait for another occasion.
Let's do it again soon.
And look, thanks very much for your time and for your wisdom. And I look forward to catching up with you again in the not too distant future.
We'll do that. Thank you very much. Great to be with you today.
If you like that video, Please like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the channel. If you'd like to see more from TIO, check out the Substack link. Or if you'd like to see more from me, check out my Substack in the description.